be beginning this morning with one of the most significant financial battles in South Africa's democratic history. The Constitutional Court is this week the stage for a high-stakes showdown that is involving around 28 banks, both local and some heavyweights of banking internationally. They're accused of colluding to manipulate the rand against the dollar. The Competition Commission first brought this case back in 2015, alleging cartel-like behavior, fixing exchange rates, diverting and dividing up markets and rigging bids to profit at the expense of South Africans. And over the years, the case has bounced between tribunals and appeal courts, with the jurisdiction being the major stumbling block. Now, the Apex Court, the biggest court in the land, will decide whether the Commission has the authority to go after foreign banks, and crucially, whether South Africa's own biggest banks must finally answer to some of these allegations that have been labeled against them. And yeah, it's a bit complex, a bit complicated, but we have political economist Dr. Dale McKinley, who's going to answer some of the key questions about how all of this might have happened, and ultimately how it affected you as an ordinary South African. And Dr. Dale McKinley is joining us via our virtual platform. Doc, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure having you on Salam Media. Really appreciate you giving us your time.
Sure. My pleasure, Salelo. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we can kickstart the conversation with maybe in the most simplest of ways, if you can just unpack this shenanigan for ordinary South Africans, because I think there's a lot of jargon that gets thrown into your face when, you know, conversations around Forex and international markets and just the whole, you know, ecosystem of banking and how all of this has been happening. Just in the simplest of ways, what did the banks do to the rand and why should they be held accountable?
Sure. So to try to bring it down into a fairly simple explanation, basically what the Competition Commission is alleging is that several, as you mentioned, several South African banks, but also quite a number of international banks colluded to manipulate the price of currency currency trading. And what does that mean? It means, okay, so let's just give one example. You're an organization or you're a business in South Africa. You're going to get paid in US dollars. For example, this was on the US dollar to rand exchange rate, these allegations. And a company in the United States is going to pay you for services rendered. That money comes in, gets sent to your bank account in South Africa, or international bank. And what happens is the bank basically, anybody who's done a foreign currency transaction will know this. The bank basically then determines what the spot price is or what the price of the currency is that day. So let's say 17.5 rand to the US dollar, they'll give you, and they'll offer you this and say, we'll exchange that amount of money for that amount of rand or whatever it is. And then they'll initiate the transaction on the basis of that. So what the Competition Commission is alleging is that not only did these banks and the traders from these banks collude to basically fix the price, fix the currency price at a level which would give them further profit, in other words, make them more money. But what they did is they withheld information on platforms until bids were the higher. So, you know, the currency can start the day at 17.5 and end at 18. Sometimes, so it can fluctuate quite regularly. So if you hold on for 6 or 7 hours, you might the exchange could go quite extensive, and you could make more money on that basis. So that would be an example of what they're colluding. They're actually making allegations that they did more than that, that they used also other means and they withheld information and had a secret sort of collusion agreement, just like the bread price fixing scandal. If people remember that, when they fixed the price of bread with bread makers. So that's basically the gist of the allegations and what they're saying.
I was just, you know, watching the proceedings in court yesterday, and I think one of the arguments that the banks were making is the fact that they are suffering, you know, reputational damage from this. They're saying they've been unfairly, you know, having their images tarnished, while the representatives of the Competition Commission say the banks never really had to properly answer for some of these charges. Just looking at it, analyzing it, who has the stronger case in your view here?
Look, I'm not a lawyer, legal expert, but I think if you look back, this case began actually 2015.
Yeah.
So it's been going for almost a decade now. Basically, I think that there's a big issue. You mentioned it in the introductory remarks, which is jurisdiction. So the key argument to the banks is that the Competition Commission doesn't have jurisdiction, particularly over banks that are not domiciled and don't have in South Africa, and where they're arguing that those transactions didn't take place within the South African architecture, so therefore they don't apply. And then the second argument that they're making is that this is not a constitutional issue. Then why is it going to the Constitutional Court? Because there's no constitutional issue involved. So those are fairly, I mean, one could say those are fairly strong arguments, but the Competition Commission, I think, is testing the law. One, and basically, which I think is an interesting test, which is to say who does have jurisdiction. If it's not us, who is it? And that would be interesting to get that finality on that, which would then provide possibly for other avenues of prosecution if it was not the Competition Commission. And then the other aspect of it, of course, is whether or not, in this case, something like Iran manipulation, which would affect consumers and customers to some extent, involves some kind of constitutional right or constitutional issue. And those are the two things. I think they are fairly evenly matched in some ways. Legally, the arguments are fairly strong. And it's an interesting case. It could end up where the Constitutional Court makes rulings that don't directly impact on these banks, but could impact on future transactions and give clarity to who can go after them and what the field of sort of legal terrain is in relation to international financial architecture, which is, of course, as you mentioned, one of those areas which is heavily unregulated, and we don't know much about it. So this is an important case beyond just these banks. It's an important case for us going forward as to who holds banks accountable, knowing, for example, in the state capture case, where banks were involved in the manipulation of money laundering and all sorts of other things as well.
And I want to expand, I think, on a point that you touched, the fact that, it's ordinary South Africans that were affected by this. That's why maybe it needs to be a constitutional court issue. If we can expand on that for the ordinary South African who's listening to this at this moment, this morning, already struggling with the cost of living. If you can just explain again in plain language, what does this alleged RAND manipulation actually mean for them? How were they directly affected by this?
Sure. So, I mean, again, I'll take the example. Any financial transaction which involves, in this case, the US dollar. So if you're getting paid, if you're an NGO, for example, and you're getting donor money from the United States, if you're a business which is getting paid in US dollars for some product or service that you've rendered, or if you're just an individual and you have relatives in the United States or somewhere else that are sending you money in US dollars as a gift, as a donation, whatever it is, you'll be affected. How will you be affected? By the fact that you might not get your money's worth. Simple as that. So essentially, what they're saying, it's basically, let me give an example which people might understand, which is the overdraft rate. There was a case many years ago where many of us who bank, sometimes we go into overdraft. We basically access those reserve funds, and we know that doing so oftentimes basically triggers a higher interest rate. We're going to have to pay a little bit more to access those funds. What banks were caught doing many years ago was they were manipulating the interest rate on the overdraft, and it was 0.5%. But when you have millions of transactions a day, that adds up to a lot of money. So essentially, if you manipulate the price of the currency and it's zero, it's maybe even 5 cents on the dollar or 2 cents on the dollar or whatever it is, that will give you a huge amount of profit and a huge amount of extra money at the expense of your customer or client.
Very, very concerning. Some banks have already settled or, applied for some kind of leniency, while others are still continuing, to fight, the Competition Commission tooth and nail in court. What does this tell us about the culture just inside the banking sector?
Well, I think we all would probably not have too much problem agreeing that banks are generally fairly secretive. We don't know a lot about how they work, their inner workings. The regulatory structure of our banks is there. We have a financial sector conduct authority and everything else, but we've had numerous cases over the last many years where banks have been involved in very questionable activities or activities that, should we say, might break the law or might be sailing close to that line. So in that sense, it's very secretive. We have, and this raises the issue. Remember, we talked about constitutional issues. One of the constitutional issues that could be argued is access to information. We have a right to access to information, and to if we don't know the information that our financial provider is doing, it's just like many people is listening here or would understand how they get frustrated. They get sometimes not just with banks, but insurance companies, with medical aids. You don't know actually how they're making their decisions and all the information that is there to inform that decision. So in that case, I think there are some serious issues at stake here. But it tells us generally that the banks themselves are not regulated enough. I would argue that they are too secretive, that they are operating oftentimes in the shadows, and they take advantage of that, and they're making lots of money doing it, and they know this. So while you might have some banks that might have a strong case and say, well, we weren't doing what you're alleging, there's other banks clearly here that are trying to sort of hedge their bets and basically try to fight a legal battle in order to get away from paying any consequences for behavior that they understand and know was illegal and they should never have engaged in.
And just looking at the bigger picture, South Africa is trying to attract investment while still maintaining a lot of, financial stability of some sort. This case specifically, does this strengthen our institutions, or does it risk scaring off investors?
Look, I don't think it has too much of a issue with regards to scaring off investors. I mean, if you look globally, banks have been involved in these kinds of cases in many countries, accused of such collusion, accused of hiding funds, accused of being fronts for all sorts of other illegal monies that are flowing through, and generally not being particularly accountable to the legal frameworks in the countries that they're domiciled in. So I think that essentially in that case, what this tells us is that in global terms, it's not just South Africa, but here, and this is the thing about banks. I mean, most of these banks that are in the 28 that are listed in this case are international banks. Yes, we do have First National, we have Standard Bank and Nedbank, I believe, are the three main local ones. But the vast majority of them are huge. JP Morgan Chase, HSBC, BNP Paribas from Europe. All these are huge international banks. And what it basically indicates to us is that over the last 20, 25 years, that international financial architecture, which is there, has sort of has become unaccountable. And I think in that case, these cases are not going to make other investors say, no, we're not going to invest in South Africa because they're cracking down on a bank. I think basically this is just part of doing business in some ways. And banks are not particularly worried about it because even if in many cases they are found guilty, they're slapped on the wrist. They're given a fine of a few $1 million. They pay it. It's like nothing for them. And so I think the larger question here is where it would possibly have implications for people making investment decisions is if the Constitutional Court, or in this case, were to come down very hard, and the banks would have to pay a fairly hefty price for this kind of thing. Up until now, that's not the case. So I don't think it would have much of an impact, no, in that case.
All right. I think we're going to leave on that note, Dr. Dale McKinley. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for unpacking it in the most simplest of terms for our audience. Really, really appreciate it.
No problem. Okay.
There you go. That was political economist Dr. Dale McKinley helping us make sense of the rand manipulation case that is now before the Constitutional Court. And I think, it's very, very important to follow that one. It's a decision that could not only impact South Africa's banking giants, but I think to an extent also the credibility of our competition watchdog. And I think as Dr. Dale McKinley mentioned there, banks are seemingly a law unto themselves. They're not regulated enough. There's so much secrecy, that they get away with. That's why we end up with this, situation where colluding is happening, situation where a manipulation of a whole rand, a currency of a sovereign country by private banks. So I think it's very, very important that we take a look at it. I think as South Africans educate ourselves on it, because these kind of things definitely affect us personally, especially with the high cost of living, and for those that are in business, that are doing business with other countries in foreign exchange. The time is 8:30, and while us here in South Africa fighting for financial accountability from major banks. Nigeria is claiming a major counter-terror victory. Two of the country's most wanted militant leaders have been captured, a move that the government says could cripple extremist networks. I think if you know about Nigeria, you would know that they've been struggling with insurgency, mostly I think in the southern parts of the country. Boko Haram comes to mind and other militant militia groups. But I think this arrest, I think, signals, I think, a kind of sign that there's real work that's been done, real progress, or maybe just a temporary win in the fight against insurgency. But we'll be putting those questions to Nigerian-based international relations expert Dr. Mukhtar Imam. That's coming up next after this short break. We'll be heading over to Nigeria for our #AfricaFocus feature. You don't want to miss it.